The morning began as usual again in the semi-darkness of the pre-dawn light that barely made its way through the thick curtains. Faint lights lit up in the kitchen, reflected in her cup of tea. Dorothy got up before James again, as she had been for several weeks. Her early opening eyes, like every movement, became an invisible beacon for James, as if they were imperceptibly changing the usual order of things. It seemed that this silence had been cozy and familiar before, but now it stretched between them like a stretched thread. Dorothy was quietly busy in the kitchen, trying not to think, but her thoughts involuntarily swirled around their recent conversations and meetings. James noticed her detachment, her fleeting glances into the distance, her detachment when she looked through the window. She often looked at the garden, which he had never redone, although he had promised many years ago. This inconspicuous garden became for her a metaphor for her life. Much was promised, but never fulfilled. Previously these thoughts did not bring pain, but now they caused a sharp sense of loss. She knew it wasn't James's fault that her feelings had cooled, but knowing that didn't ease the mental burden. When James entered the kitchen, his gaze lingered on her for a second longer than usual. He walked slowly to the table and sat down without saying a word. It seemed that there was something of condemnation and understanding in that look at the same time. Dorothy sensed it, but she also sensed his indecision, his desire to ask something, and at the same time his fear of hearing an answer. Finally, James broke the silence.
You're up early again, aren't you?
Dorothy continued to stir her tea with a spoon, her movements becoming slightly slower, as if she was trying to stall for time, avoiding their inevitable conversation.
Yes, you do. Sometimes it's easier for me to be alone before the house is fully awake.
He looked at her with a thoughtful expression, noticing how her fingers were trembling, as if she was holding something inside.
I feel like there's something between us. It's changed. You've changed, Dorothy.
She sighed, placing the spoon on the edge of the cup. Her gaze remained fixed on the window, as if she could find the answers to all her questions behind it.
I've changed. Yeah, I guess. I just don't feel like the woman I used to be anymore, James.
And what does this mean for us?
There was sadness mixed with incomprehension in his voice. He looked at her, as if she were a stranger, trying to figure out who was standing in front of him, and why this woman, whom he had known for 30 years, now seemed so far away.
I don't know, James. I don't know. It just seems to me sometimes that I missed something important. It's as if everything I once aspired to has disappeared among habits and routine tasks.
James sighed, lowering his head and thoughtfully looking at his hands, intertwined on the table. He didn't know how to react to her words, didn't know what to say. He was used to her devotion, to her constancy, and now, when she seemed to be on the verge of some incomprehensible change for him, he felt cheated.
I thought we were both happy with what we have. A home, stability, children who have grown up. Isn't that what we wanted?
She chuckled softly, but there was more bitterness than joy in that grin.
Yes, James, that's exactly what I wanted, once. But sometimes I feel like I've just become part of the furniture in this house, part of this routine, and maybe that's what I wanted. And now I feel like I've lost myself.
James fell silent. He stared at her for a long time, as if he saw before him the ghost of her former dreams and ambitions, and it was bitter for him to realize that in 30 years he might not have recognized her real one. Her words cut him like a rusty knife, cutting into the very essence of their marriage.
Do you understand what you're saying? You're casting a shadow over everything we've built, everything we have. You're saying that our life was it a mistake?
Her face turned to stone. She knew that his words, like her own, had become unbearably sharp.
I'm not saying it was a mistake, James. I'm saying that all we have is that it was, and probably won't be anymore. Simply, sometimes I feel like I've never really been myself in my whole life.
He got up and walked to the window, turning his back to her. He couldn't look into her eyes, couldn't believe that she, his faithful Dorothy, thought of herself as a stranger. He wanted to ask her why she felt so lonely, why he couldn't give her what she was looking for, but he was afraid to hear the answer.
And what do you want? What are you looking for, Dorothy? Youth? Romance? What? We've lived together for so many years, and now you're saying you don't need any of this.
His words sounded bitter and disappointed. He felt rejected, not needed, as if she had already decided to leave a long time ago, but only now decided to tell him this. But instead of answering, Dorothy was silent. She just sat there, staring into her teacup, as if she could see the answers to his questions there.
I'm not looking for youth, James. I don't know how to explain it. You know, it's like I'm living according to some script that I've learned by heart a long time ago. I'm just playing a role, without real feelings. I miss myself.
She paused, trying to find words that wouldn't break his heart.
Sometimes I think that maybe I never knew what it was like to be myself. I've always been someone, a wife, a mother, a hostess. It was only when it all started to seem empty to me that I realized I didn't know who I really was.
James flinched at her words. He turned around abruptly, unable to listen to her self-deprecation and self-examination any longer. It was unbearable for him to see her like this, lost, pathetic, the woman he had always considered strong and confident.
So I wasn't the kind of person you could be yourself with? You. Couldn't you be yourself next to me? What have you been missing, Dorothy? Answer me directly.
She sighed softly, realizing that this conversation could lead them to the point of no return. But she knew she couldn't keep quiet anymore. She needed to say everything that she had been hiding in herself for too long.
I do not know, James. I do not know what I was missing, and I do not know what I need now. It's just that something has changed inside of me. It's not your problem. It's probably me. I miss myself, who I could be.
They fell silent again, and that silence hung in the air, heavy as the walls separating them. James lowered his head, feeling anger and impotence boil inside him. He wanted to scream, to accuse her of ingratitude, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. She was next to him, but at the same time so far away, as if she was standing on the other side of the river.
I always thought it would be enough to be together, build a house, support each other. But apparently that's not enough for you.
He sighed and looked at her again, trying to find something familiar in her eyes, something that had once attracted him to her. But there was only alienation and sadness in her eyes that he couldn't understand.
Maybe I really never knew you, Dorothy. But it's scary, you know. It's scary to think that everything we have might mean nothing.
Those words sent a dull ache through her heart. She knew that she had hurt him, knew that his words reflected the fear and pain that she herself had awakened. But she knew it was too late to try to change anything.
I'm scared too, James. It's scary to realize that I've lived for so many years without understanding who I really am. And it doesn't mean that I don't love you or appreciate what we have. Simply, I have to find something of my own to finally feel alive.
Her voice trailed off, and silence fell again. It had been a week since her last conversation with James, but Dorothy felt a sense of inevitability bubbling inside, as if her life was about to change completely. That day she decided to take a walk in the park, where she could afford to escape from everyday life for at least a moment and let her thoughts develop freely. The park was flooded with golden light. Autumn gradually turned the trees into warm shades, and the air was cool and clean. She walked slowly along the path, almost touching the ground, until she heard a familiar voice behind her. It was Marcus, who, noticing her in the distance, decided to come over and say hello. When their eyes met, they stopped for a moment, and silence hung between them.
Dorothy. You again. I didn't expect to see you here at all.
You know, sometimes it feels like I'm just walking in circles. This park has become something like that for me. Salvation. I can get away from everything for a little bit here.
She lowered her gaze, as if she was afraid that her eyes would betray her inner torment. But Marcus caught this mood, as if he had read her thoughts.
You still look like the first time we met here, Dorothy. Only now there is something new in your eyes. Something dark. What's happening? You know you can trust me.
His voice was soft, as it had been when they were young. Dorothy suddenly felt her throat constrict and the words stuck on her tongue. But she understood that she could no longer hide her feelings, she could no longer keep them to herself. She took a deep breath and slowly released it, as if trying to relieve at least some of this weight.
Sometimes I feel like I'm confused. I feel like I can't stay where I am now, but I can't leave either. It's like a cage that I'm trying to break out of, but its walls are getting tighter and tighter.
Marcus nodded, listening intently, and there was something in his eyes that made her continue. Her voice was low, as if she was afraid that the wrong ears would hear her, or that this confession would break the silence in which they stood.
What's stopping you? You've always been brave. You've always moved forward, even if it scared you. What has changed, Dorothy?
Everything has changed, Marcus. I have a family, children, a house. James, we've lived together for so many years. Sometimes I feel like I'm betraying not only him, but everyone around me, even myself. But at the same time, I feel that if I continue to live the way I used to live, I will lose myself completely.
Marcus was looking at her intently, and there was something in his gaze that both excited and alarmed her. He understood her, but he also knew that her pain was deeper than she could put into words. He walked slowly over to her and gently put his hand on her shoulder.
You don't have to live for what's expected of you, Dorothy. You're a human being too. You deserve to be happy too. Isn't that important?
Her heart sank at his words. She had always considered herself a faithful wife, a caring mother, but now it seemed to her that for this concern for others she had betrayed herself. She looked at Marcus and felt tormented by the question she was afraid to ask.
What if everything I did was to meet expectations? What if? Have I never been really happy? Maybe I just needed to convince myself that I was happy with my life because that's the way it's done.
Marcus frowned, feeling her pain. He knew he couldn't answer that question for her, but he understood that she was suffering, and it made him feel pain too. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice low and deep.
Then why don't you try to live a different life, Dorothy? Why not let yourself be yourself at least once? Let yourself. Dreaming like before.
Dorothy, hearing these words, turned away. She couldn't get enough air. She felt that every sentence of Marcus was becoming a challenge for her. She knew she had to find answers inside herself, but she was afraid to admit that she didn't know what she really wanted.
And if it's easy? An illusion, Marcus? If all I feel is just running away from what's eating me? If I'm just trying to escape and not solve my problems?
Marcus looked at her thoughtfully, trying to find the words to give her some comfort.
Maybe it's an illusion. But Dorothy, sometimes it's moments like this that give us answers that we haven't been able to find for years. You shouldn't blame yourself for living, and if this is an escape, then so be it. We all run away sometimes to get back to ourselves.
His words penetrated deeper than he could have imagined. Dorothy realized that for her these feelings were not just a hobby or a moment of nostalgia, it was an opportunity to find herself again, an opportunity to live outside the framework that she had imposed on herself. But her inner conflict did not allow her to simply give up everything she had created with James. She looked at Marcus and saw that he was ready to support her, but she understood that this was her own path, and no one could walk it for her.
I know, Marcus. But sometimes it seems to me that if I choose this path, I will lose everything I have. Everything that James and I have built. How can I leave everything like that?
Marcus looked at her with genuine sympathy. He understood that for her, it was a choice between duty and freedom, and that her every thought was now connected with this gap. He couldn't take on her pain, but he wanted to give her at least some support.
You don't have to decide now, Dorothy. Just give yourself some time. Allow yourself to be honest at least with yourself. There is no need to rush to answers. All I ask is that you don't betray your feelings.
She felt that weight on her heart again. She knew that his words were correct, but she also understood that her fear was the fear of change, the fear of destroying everything she had built over the years. That fear had become a part of her, and now she felt she couldn't get rid of it.
Marcus, what if it's not just fear? What if I can't live without James? After all, for so long I lived for him, for our family. I'm not sure I can be happy by destroying it all.
His gaze was soft and full of understanding. He knew that her pain was real, that she was really afraid of change. He squeezed her hand gently, looking into her eyes.
You don't have to decide everything now, Dorothy. Just let yourself feel it. Don't give up on yourself for the sake of duty if it brings you suffering. Sometimes the only way to understand what's important to us is to let ourselves experience it.
Those words awakened something deep in her, something she had long forgotten. She realized that her inner conflict is not just a choice between two people, it is a struggle for her own freedom, for the right to be herself. She was afraid of this freedom because she did not know what it would lead to. But now she realized that it was impossible to continue living in a state where she was forced to deny her feelings.
It seems to me that I've been hiding behind a role and responsibilities for so long that now I don't know how to get back to myself. I'm afraid that if I let myself be myself, I won't be able to go back.
Marcus looked at her with a slight smile, his voice low but confident.
And maybe you don't need to go back, Dorothy. Maybe forward is the only direction you need right now. But it's your choice, and yours alone.
She closed her eyes, feeling her heart beating in a frenzied rhythm. These words sounded true, but also scary. She understood that this was not just her own struggle, but something that concerned everyone around her. But she also realized that she couldn't keep pretending anymore.
Thank you, Marcus. I do not know what will happen next, but thank you for being here. For not letting me forget who I am.
Marcus touched her hand gently. His touch was warm. And there was so much support in it that she hadn't felt in a long time.
Always, Dorothy. I will always be here to remind you of that.
They sat side by side in silence for a long time, feeling the silence of the autumn park, and each of them realized that this silence was filled with all their words, all their secrets and fears. It's been a few days since Dorothy and Marcus met in the park. She returned home deeply immersed in her thoughts, and once again tried to figure out what choice she had to make. Her inner conflict became more acute, and although she tried to behave as usual, James noticed that her gaze became somehow detached, as if her soul was far away from their home. James, tormented by suspicion and growing anxiety, could no longer remain silent. He felt that the moment had come for a conversation that had been begging for a long time, but which he postponed for fear of destroying the delicate peace that still remained between them. However, his patience was running out, and he decided to find out what was going on with his wife. One evening, when Dorothy returned from a walk, James was sitting in the living room, lost in thought. He heard her footsteps in the hallway, and when she entered, he looked at her with restraint. There was tension between them, which they both felt, but neither dared to break. James sighed, gathering his strength.
Dorothy, we need to talk.
Her heart sank, and she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She knew this moment was inevitable, but she didn't think it would come so soon. She sat down quietly in front of him, not looking up, as if she was afraid that her gaze would betray her thoughts.
About what, James?
He looked at her intently, and there was so much pain and doubt in his gaze that she could no longer avoid his gaze. He saw her every move, every breath, and finally asked the question that had been tormenting him for a long time.
Are you seeing someone, Dorothy? Tell me the truth. I can't live in guesses anymore.
Her heart stopped, and at that moment she realized that she no longer had the strength to hide the truth. But the words couldn't come out of her mouth, as if every letter was made of guilt and pain. She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible.
Yes, James, I was dating someone. But it's not what you think it is.
James flinched at her confession, but tried to remain calm. His heart was pounding so loudly that he could barely hear his own thoughts, but he knew he had to figure it out to the end.
Who is he? Who is this person for whom you decided to push me away and everything we have?
She looked at him with an expression of guilt, and her gaze was full of regret. She didn't want to hurt him, but she knew that there was no turning back, that her words would destroy everything they had built together.
His name is Marcus. He was my first love. I met him by chance a few weeks ago, and all this stirred up those feelings that I had long considered lost.
James chuckled bitterly, feeling pain and jealousy fill his heart. He hadn't expected her words to provoke such a strong reaction. It seemed to him that their marriage was solid, but now he realized that his confidence was an illusion.
So you've chosen your first love. How many years have passed? Do you really think you can just go back to feeling like we didn't matter all these years?
His words tore her apart. She knew he was right, her actions might seem pointless, but the feeling she felt defied logic. She felt her heart torn between duty and what she believed to be the truth about herself.
James, this is not what you think it is. I never wanted to betray you or ruin our marriage. I feel like something inside me has been lost. Ever since I met Marcus, I've started to remember the self I used to be before. Became the one you know now.
James frowned, his voice harsh, filled with reproach and disappointment.
And how, Dorothy, could you live with me all these years if you felt like someone else? Do you think we've been strangers all this time? Didn't our lives matter to you?
Her eyes filled with tears, and she couldn't hold back her feelings any longer. She knew that every sentence she said would only hurt him, but she couldn't continue to live a lie.
James, our lives mattered to me. Everything we have is important to me, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm lost. I do not know how to explain it in a way that you understand. I just felt like I wasn't myself anymore. Marcus, he reminded me who I am.
James stood up abruptly, clenching his fists and looking at her with rage and pain. He wanted to scream, to blame her for ruining their union, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to ease his pain.
You talk about yourself like it's the most important thing. What about us? Dorothy? What about me? Haven't I ever supported you? Wasn't I there for you when you needed help? And now you're telling me that some man from the past made you remember who you are. Do you even realize how humiliating this is?
His words stabbed into her like knives, and she felt her guilt getting heavier. She couldn't deny that he was right, but she also understood that her feelings couldn't just be thrown out of her heart.
I know it's not fair, James. I can't justify my actions, but they don't make my condition any less real. I can't ignore the fact that I don't feel alive anymore.
James turned away, clasping his hands behind his head, trying to contain his emotions. He felt that he had lost her, that everything he had aspired to in their marriage was now ruined by her confession.
So what now, Dorothy? Will you just leave to find your true self? Will you leave me, our family, everything that we built?
Dorothy closed her eyes, feeling tears running down her cheeks. She knew that she could no longer continue to live in this gap between her feelings and duty. She knew she had to make a choice, but it was a painful choice.
I do not know, James. I do not know how to do the right thing. I don't want to leave you, but I can't go on living as if nothing has changed inside of me.
He slowly turned to her, his eyes filled with pain and despair.
You can't have both, Dorothy. You have to choose. I'm not ready to be part of a marriage where one of us has already passed away. If you choose Marcus, then it will be the end for us.
Those words seemed to cut through her heart. She knew that by continuing to meet with Marcus, she was destroying everything that had been between her and James, but she also knew that by abandoning Marcus, she would betray herself. Her voice was barely audible, but it contained the full weight of her struggle.
I'm not asking you to understand me, James, but please believe that I don't want to hurt you. I'm just trying to figure out how to live with myself.
James took a deep breath, looking at her with an expression that was a mixture of pain, anger, and impotence. It seemed to him that his whole world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it.
Then decide, Dorothy, because I can't live in this between. Either you're with me, or you're not here anymore.
Dorothy sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the floor, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She knew that the moment of truth had come, but her heart was bursting with fear of this choice. Autumn brought down cold rains on the city, which made the streets more grey and inhospitable every day. Dorothy returned home with the feeling that her own life, like this city, was sinking into a dullness from which there was no escape. The meetings with Marcus continued, but now the painful question arose more and more clearly in her head and heart: what does this really mean? What role does Marcus play in her life now, the one that was once meaningful to her, or just the embodiment of nostalgia that keeps her in the past? The first meetings with Marcus were like a breath of fresh air for Dorothy, as if she had opened a window and let a long-forgotten cool wind into a stuffy room. His words and touches made her feel alive, awakened in her the energy that she had been losing for years, mired in the familiar family routine. Marcus reminded her not only of the romance of her youth, but also of the dreams she was building then, of the aspirations she had before she chose another path: stability and predictability with James. But as the meetings continued, Dorothy's feelings became more complicated. She was no longer sure that she was looking for the passion in Marcus that could give her happiness. Rather, her connection with him became something else, a kind of reminder of what she was missing. Her heart was torn between two worlds. One is a world of stability and familiarity, where James is waiting for her, and the other is a world of old memories, where every look from Marcus reminds her of who she once was, while she could still choose her future without regard to obligations. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her attraction to Marcus was not so much love as an attempt to regain her lost sense of freedom. Once upon a time, he was everything to her, the embodiment of passion, romance, the promise of a life filled with movement and discovery. But now, looking at him, she realized that their connection was an illusion, an attempt to bring back a past that could no longer be revived. In him she was looking not so much for love, but for the opportunity to return that part of herself that she had buried long ago. At some point, this realization hurt her, as if Marcus, who had been her salvation, suddenly turned out to be a reminder of her own losses and sacrifices. He symbolized what she couldn't keep when she chose to live with James. He was a reflection of her youth, her ambitions and dreams, but he was not a real person with whom she could become truly happy again. At some point, Dorothy realized that her connection with Marcus was not love, but an escape, a way to escape from the responsibility and pain she felt while in a marriage that had become a routine for her. She began to think that her marriage to James was not a mistake at all, that the years spent with him were not wasted. Their relationship filled her life not with the sharpness and passion that she had in her youth, but with a quiet, steady devotion that over the years became their foundation. James became for her the person with whom she shared everything: joys, sorrows, worries and worries. Yes, their marriage hadn't had the spark she'd once seen in Marcus for a long time, but that didn't mean her life with James was any less meaningful. The realization shocked her to the core. She began to think that maybe she was attracted to Marcus only because he represented something she had once missed. He was for her an image of her own youth, a part of her unfulfilled dreams, and perhaps she became attached to him precisely because she saw in him what she had lost. But she also understood that their bond could not replace what she had created with James. They had a common story, full of trials and overcoming difficulties, which connected them much deeper than just passion and romance. This outburst of sincerity was painful for her, but it brought some relief. She realized that her feelings for Marcus were nothing more than a reflection of her inner dissatisfaction, and not true love. Her attraction to him was a way to fill the void that had arisen in her soul due to her own loss of self. But now she realized that returning to Marcus would not give her happiness, it would only drag her deeper into the illusion. Real happiness should not have been in the outside, but inside her. These thoughts pierced her, and she returned home with a feeling of relief and at the same time longing. Now she knew she had to start a conversation with James. She had to admit that her quest was just an escape. She realized that, despite all the difficulties, her place was next to him, and that their relationship needed not a break, but a new look, honesty and openness that had been lost over the years. That night, when Dorothy realized the true nature of her feelings for Marcus, she couldn't sleep. Her mind wandered around everything that had happened in recent weeks' meetings with Marcus, their conversations, the awakening of old memories, the unexpected internal conflict that had arisen between her past and present. She felt herself inexorably drawn to talking to James now. It was impossible to avoid, and she realized that she had to be honest with him, even if the truth hurt both her and him. The long silence between them became unbearable, weighing on her soul like a heavy burden that could not be rid of. The next morning, Dorothy felt unaccustomed confidence, although she knew that this conversation would be one of the most difficult in her life. There was a mixture of fear and relief in her soul. She was afraid to destroy their usual way of life, but at the same time she was tormented by the feeling that she could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. For many years she hid her true feelings and suppressed her discontent, trying to convince herself that her life was right and complete. But now, faced with the truth about herself, she realized that she had to give James a chance to hear her thoughts, her pain, and her doubts. This is the only way they can decide if their marriage has a future. When Dorothy finally decided to talk, she noticed how intensely James was listening to her words. With each confession, with each admission of her pain and loss, his face grew more serious. She told him about her feelings, about her meetings with Marcus, about how memories of the past had awakened long-forgotten dreams and ambitions in her. She explained that her desire for Marcus was not true love, but rather a desire to regain a lost sense of freedom. It was a confession she could hardly accept herself, and it hurt her to see how her words hurt James. At the same time, as she said it all out loud, she realized that her feelings for James had never been truly lost. Their relationship had changed, become more complicated, overgrown with many layers of everyday worries and habits, but they were still meaningful to her. However, she could not ignore the fact that for many years she had suppressed her desires and ambitions for the sake of her family. She understood that her marriage was strong, but this strength turned into a cage for her, in which she stopped feeling alive. James, hearing her confession, felt his world crumble. He understood that their life was far from perfect, but he always believed in their union, that their common values and support for each other were the foundation that could not be destroyed. For him, their marriage was a source of strength and stability, and now he was suddenly faced with a reality in which his wife, his partner for so many years, felt like a stranger. He felt betrayed and humiliated. It hurt him to realize that Dorothy had found solace in another person, even if not in love, but in a simple search for herself. As Dorothy spoke her thoughts out loud, she began to realize how important this conversation was not only for James, but also for herself. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to speak honestly, without trying to hide her feelings or adjust to his expectations. She had been prepared for the fact that her confession could lead to a breakup, but now she realized that the most important thing for her was this honesty. She saw that years of habit and tacit agreement between them had made their relationship shallow, devoid of depth and sincerity. And although she was afraid of losing James, she realized that she could no longer live in the shadow of her hidden feelings and unexpressed desires. James, although he felt anger and pain, began to realize that a lot of things needed to be reconsidered in their relationship. He understood that they were both playing their roles, content with a superficial harmony that actually hid their discontent and disappointment. They both became hostages of their responsibilities, the desire for stability, but in the end, it made their union fragile and lifeless. James began to realize that his own needs and desires had also been forgotten in this struggle for a normal life, and that his sense of stability was just an illusion. After long hours of frank conversation, they both felt that they had reached a new point from which there was no turning back. It was a moment of reassessment of their marriage, their life together, and themselves. They realized that they couldn't just go back to their old lives without making profound changes. They realized that their relationship does not need to be preserved for the sake of habit or duty. It must be genuine, sincere and free from lies and prejudice. Dorothy and James eventually decided to separate, realizing that their marriage had become an obstacle for each of them to self-realization and the search for happiness. It was a difficult decision, but it gave them a chance for a new life, for the opportunity to regain the freedom and independence that they had lost. It was a release for Dorothy. She felt that she could finally start a life in which she didn't have to suppress her desires. James, despite the pain and disappointment, also realized that now he has a chance to reconsider his priorities, learn to be honest with himself. The breakup with James turned out to be an important stage in Dorothy's spiritual growth. She realized that she was looking for something in her relationship with Marcus that she lacked in herself, and that now she had to rebuild her life, without attachments and illusions. After parting with James, Dorothy was left alone in their family home, which now seemed to her not a cozy shelter, but a cold shadow of the past. The rooms were filled with memories that had become a part of her life, the photographs on the walls, the furniture they chose together, and the little things that had made up their life together for many years. Every corner of the house was saturated with the past, which now became a heavy burden for her. She understood that if she stayed here, she would not be able to move forward, facing every day a reminder of the life she had left behind. After much thought, Dorothy decided to leave the house and leave. This decision did not come easy to her. she was afraid to start from scratch, to leave a place that was a symbol of stability and security. But she also knew that it was this stability that was for her the cage from which she had been striving to escape for so long. Now that she was free of obligations, it seemed to her that for the first time in many years she could manage her life the way she wanted. She packed her things and left the house, leaving behind everything that reminded her of the past. Dorothy went to the small coastal town that she and James had once dreamed of, but never found the time to visit. Now she has decided that this place will become her new home. She rented a small apartment overlooking the sea and began to settle into this new world for her. Her days became simple and calm, filled with walks along the shore and reading books that she had not had time for before. She studied the city, got to know the locals, and tried to find a new occupation for herself that would give her joy and a sense of meaning. At first, loneliness was not easy for her. Dorothy was used to being with James, sharing her thoughts and worries with him, and now she was surrounded by silence, which was broken only by the sounds of the sea. However, as the days turned into weeks, she began to appreciate this silence. She didn't have to adjust to anyone's expectations, she didn't have to follow a schedule or obey a routine. This time was an opportunity for her to return to herself, to who she used to be, before marriage and all obligations. She began to rediscover the simple joys of life that had previously eluded her. At first, she felt guilty about her choice. She felt like she had destroyed something that was important to her and to James. She often wondered how he was coping, how he was going through their breakup, and felt the pain of realizing that she had brought him suffering. But she also understood that their breakup was inevitable, that both of them had long lost the sincerity in their relationship that they should have kept. Now she realized that her choice was a step towards gaining inner freedom, and every day this thought strengthened in her heart. Gradually, her life began to take on a new rhythm. She signed up for painting courses, which she had long dreamed of attending, but which she had never found time for. Inspired by the nature and tranquility of the coastal city, she began to paint landscapes, people, and the moments she saw around her. This activity became a source of joy and satisfaction for her. She felt that art helped her express the emotions she had been suppressing for so long. Through paints and a brush, she explored her inner state, and each new drawing filled her life with meaning. Over time, she began to make new acquaintances, participate in city events, and communicate with people who inspired her with their life experiences. These were people who, like her, were looking for peace and harmony. Many of them had moved to this city to start life from scratch, and their stories gave her hope. She began to appreciate her loneliness as a gift that allowed her to be honest with herself, listen to her inner voice, and follow her desires. She no longer felt like she was living for someone else. Her life belonged to her alone. A few months after moving in, Dorothy began to notice how her perception of the world had changed. She stopped worrying about the past, stopped thinking about what would have happened if her life had turned out differently. Her past with James now seemed to be part of the path that had brought her to this moment. She realized that every decision she made, every event in her life was necessary for her to find herself. Her memories no longer caused pain. Now she saw in them lessons and experiences that helped her become stronger. It took several years before Dorothy fully found inner harmony. She realized that happiness does not come from external circumstances, but is born from the depths of her soul, from the ability to accept herself as she is. Now her life was filled with peace and tranquility. She felt that she had found her place in this world, that her path was not just a search for external success or recognition, but the ability to be in harmony with herself. Sometimes, walking along the coast, she caught herself thinking that she did not feel regret. The past with James no longer hurt her. It had become something important and dear, but now it was like a distant shore that she did not want to return to. One quiet evening she received a letter from James. His words were full of calmness and understanding. He thanked her for the years they had spent together and talked about the new life he had started after their separation. Dorothy smiled, feeling that they had both found what they were looking for, each their own path, on which they could be honest and free. This world, This city and her life became a new home for her, a home that was built on true sincerity and peace with herself.